Thank you. So first of all, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Chair Kimbrell for really what was incredible virtually for what I was able to watch with NARUC in your November meeting. You really represented the gas committee well and helped to facilitate a lot of educational discussion around some critical issues. And I did see there were a lot of members from the gas committee and the natural gas partnership who were really engaged quite, I thought, well in terms of helping to look at the conversations and the challenges and how we can help to move forward in the natural gas regulatory space. I also do want to say a personal thank you to those of you who reached out to me. Some of you may not be aware, but I did have some minor brain surgery actually it'll be 2 weeks on Thursday. I'm doing really well. This is actually my first time speaking and working since then. So thank you for that opportunity. SoCal Gas, the largest gas distribution utility in the United States, is implementing a multifaceted decarbonization workstream in collaboration with multiple stakeholders. It's designed to support ongoing initiatives by the California Energy Commission and California Public Utilities Commission. And this effort entails assessing pathways for meeting California's aggressive greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and the role of gas utilities in clean energy in future. What's happening in California can also be helpful to other states who are also engaged in this pathway and what may be questions that we need to ask and how we can work together to facilitate some wonderful forward progress. I'm pleased to welcome two speakers from SoCal Gas to update the committee, both the committee and the gas committee, as well as the natural gas partnership on this process and share insights from an October 2021 report, the role of clean fuels and gas infrastructure in achieving California's net zero climate goal. NARUC will share the full report. I believe we have today's slides. If not, immediately following this call, we will get that. For commissioners interested in learning more about the issues that we're going to hear about today, NARUC is currently working with SoCal Gas, the University of California at Irvine, and renewable to natural gas facilities to facilitate a site visit in March 2022. We unfortunately had to reschedule that from our October 2021 due to the ongoing COVID pandemic issues. Thanks really goes to everyone and the NARUC DOE Natural Gas Partnership is really engaged in trying to be facilitating more of these educational engagements. NARUC is going to be able to offer travel reimbursement to commissioners, but also I'm sure we do have at least one staffer who's on the natural gas partnership. So we'll be working with NARUC to ensure that travel reimbursement for commissioners and those select staffers are able to be done so that we can attend this trip at no cost to you or your state for reasonable travel reimbursement. Kira will email information about this site visit to commissioners on the gas committee, the natural gas partnership email list, as well as the designated staffers that we need to ensure are also there. Now I'd like to please welcome both Jonathan Peress and Despina Niehaus. Jonathan Peress, who I think has really been a friend to NARUC throughout his career, is currently the Senior Director of Business Strategy and Energy Policy for SoCal Gas, where he leads market and regulatory strategy development with the focus on the role of the gas grid as an enabler of California climate policy goals. Prior to joining SoCal Gas in 2020, Jonathan spent 5 years, and they're very productive years, with the Environmental Defense Fund, managing EDF's advocacy, addressing retail and wholesale natural gas and electricity markets before FERC, the regional wholesale electricity market operators, and state public utility commissions. He previously led the Conservation Law Foundation's Clean Energy and Climate Change Program And before Conservation Law Foundation, Jonathan practiced law representing gas and electric utilities at Dewey and LaBeouf. He also worked at NRG Energy, where he was the Director of Environmental Services. Jonathan sits on the board of directors of the North American Energy Standards Board and previously chaired the Air Quality Committee of the American Bar Association. He's an attorney admitted to practice in both New York and New Hampshire. Despina Niehaus is the Director of Strategic Planning for SoCal Gas, where she leads the analytical team, advancing the company's business transformation, clean fuels, and carbon management strategy. Prior to joining SoCal Gas, Despina held previous roles as at SDG&E in Strategic Planning and Regulatory Affairs, and she holds a BA in Government and Politics from the University of Maryland and a JD from California Western School of Law. She's a member of the State Bar of California. I'd now like to turn it over to both of them to do their presentations, and then we'll have Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Berman, Vice Chair Berman, and Chairman Kimbrell. Sorry, there's a lot of noise outside. Let's just take 1 second. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here, and thank you as well to Kira and Will for facilitating this conversation. Am I running the slide deck, Kira, or are you? What's your preference?
If you'd like to, you can go ahead, but I can step in if you have any difficulties.
Just get the deck going here. Can you see the slides?
Not yet.
You have to share screen first.
Yeah, I did hit share screen.
Yep, we can see now.
Okay. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Let me just say that I've had the privilege of working with Andreas and Commissioner Berman for many, many years, as well as the NARUC committee. And just to lay a little bit of context here, I joined SoCal Gas specifically because of the nature of the decarbonization and business transformation challenges that they were facing in a, as you know, in a jurisdiction with very aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets seeking to achieve net zero by 2045. Based on the work that I had done previously, I had a deep understanding of the reality, which sometimes gets overlooked, of the indispensable need for natural gas and the gas grid in order to achieve those decarbonization goals. And in that respect, I would say that some of what we're going to discuss applies in any jurisdiction because of the transformative changes that are going on, particularly with respect to renewable energy deployment on the electricity side. And what I often say is that if it weren't for the balancing resiliency and reliability services provided by the natural gas system and the gas grid, you would essentially have no material renewable deployment on the electricity grid. In other words, there's a symbiotic relationship between the services provided by the gas grid and decarbonization of the electric grid, which symbiosis will continue to grow. After I joined SoCal Gas roughly 18 months ago, we understood the need to really start doing broader transformative strategic planning, which the company really didn't have a prior need to do to the extent that they do now. And so we brought Despina in. I've had the privilege of working with Despina for a year or so. From the first day, my first conversation with her, she was a leader and ahead of the curve in understanding what is required to achieve economy-wide decarbonization. And so we're very pleased to have her as the director of our strategic planning group. So hopefully I'm going to get this to work. Okay, yeah. So in effect, when I joined, my focus and really the focus of this conversation is on what actions does a prudent gas utility operator take in this decarbonization transformative commercial and regulatory environment. So I've been around a long time. I'm close to retirement. I came to SoCal Gas in order to help create the blueprint and hopefully assist you all as state commissioners in how should a gas utility proceed in its commercial, regulatory, operational, infrastructure planning, all of those different categories in order to facilitate and achieve decarbonization in a way that meets the various public interest guideposts. And we can't lose sight of the fact, and I think commissioners will know this better than anyone, at its core, the obligation is to run a reliable and safe gas system with just and reasonable rates and affordable rates. And while emissions and climate policy are also one of those 4 tenets, you know, the core statutory requirements for operating a gas utility are those prior 3. So when we started looking at what a prudent operator, how they would evolve in consideration of decarbonization, we were guided by those statutory public interest tenets. The balance of this presentation then goes through the different aspects of what we've done, which is decarbonization goal setting, a detailed set of decarbonization modeling that Despina will discuss, and different planning approaches, including advancing planning processes at the statewide sort of PUC level, and then with a focus on the role of clean fuels and the gas grid and how it effectively interacts with electrification, which directionally is being actively pursued in California. So when shortly after I started here, we actually got a new CEO. His name is Scott Drury. I used to call myself change agent number 1 and Despina change agent number 2, but now I've ceded that over to our CEO, who's change agent number 1. He embraced it. He basically came to Despina and I and one other a VP here and said, I'm thinking about laying the gauntlet and establishing a goal of net zero emissions for the utility and our customers that basically is analogous to the goals of the state. Can we do it? So Despina and I had started the modeling that she is going to discuss prior to him establishing this goal regarding the role of the gas grid and different approaches to achieving economy-wide decarbonization. I said, well, Scott, we know how to do about 80% of it. The other 20% is a to be determined, but there's nothing unusual about it in that respect. Decarbonization of the gas grid is similar to where decarbonization of the electric grid was 20 years ago. So he courageously went out forward, and in October, I think it was, I don't know, December of 2020, made the commitment that the company would establish a goal of achieving net zero in our operations and delivery of energy by 2045. And the interesting thing about this is that 96% of the emissions attributable to natural gas use in California come from decisions that are made by customers for whom we are a common carrier. They have the right to use gas. We are required to deliver it to them. They have the right to combust gas. We need to provide the service and the gas to them. And that's different than the electric system. When you're regulating the electric grid and decarbonizing the electric grid, you're talking about emissions that the utilities are responsible for or have a significant means of control over. That is not the case on the gas grid, because we all have this, I'm sure this is the case in every state, that there's an obligation to serve, and the emissions result functionally from independent decisions of our customers, which compels us to do 2 things. Number 1, to come up with different pathways and approaches for the gas system as it fits into an economy-wide decarbonization. And number 2, to support the initiatives that the state is implementing in order to decarbonize our customers. So I'll turn it over to Despina, who will get into some of the modeling that we've done in order to inform and advise our decarbonization and operational strategies.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having us today. So as was mentioned, we recently published decarbonization analysis, and that analysis examines the cost and complexity of reaching net zero in California. It offers detailed solutions, including the clean fuels infrastructure and carbon management strategies to support decarbonization efforts. So we specifically examine how California can reach net zero GHG across its entire economy in the most reliable, resilient, and cost-effective way, but also in a manner that's as the least burdensome for customers to transition into. So our study examines 3 key questions that require answers when evaluating the path to full decarbonization. The first is, what are California's options for achieving carbon neutrality? What decarbonization solutions are resilient, affordable, feasible, and address those hard to abate activities in the economy? And third, but not least here, how can the gas infrastructure advance the clean energy transition? Next slide, please. So we conducted comprehensive decarbonization modeling. The decarbonization models that we leveraged are similar to those used in other published GHG studies, including both the California Energy Commission and the California Air Resources Board. The model is constrained to meet the state's net zero targets. So we did not entertain a scenario where the state does not meet its climate goals. In addition to the decarbonization demand side models and supply side model, we developed what is truly kind of a first of its kind, and that is the infrastructure analysis model. So this was a system level analysis that we did to determine the costs associated with different potential configurations of a clean fuels network. This would include the costs of blending hydrogen, dedicated hydrogen infrastructure, carbon management, as well as fuel cells. So the clean fuels configuration and investment needs would really depend on the scenario analyzed and the level of clean fuels infrastructure that's implicated. So to build out this analysis, we relied on SoCal Gas data, research conducted by our internal SMEs, as well as third parties, universities, national labs, other utilities. It also includes market forecasts from a range of sources and learnings from other geographies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we examined 4 different scenarios the state may take to reach its goal of net zero, assessing the costs and benefits of each pathway. It's important to note that we refer to these scenarios as corner cases, meaning that they are designed to push certain variables to their endpoints so we can better understand the interaction and trade-offs. So to summarize, 3 of the 4 scenarios that we modeled retain a fuels network. So the first one on the left, resilient electrification. Here we get to almost 100% building electrification, but it retains the resilient label because 1, it maintains the fuel backbone to provide clean fuels to electric generators to support the reliability and resiliency of the electric grid. And we also included fuel cells and would layer fuel cells in high fire threat districts or other areas such as dense urban areas that require additional fuel optionality to maintain resiliency and reliability needs. The high clean fuels scenario is really designed to examine the role of high clean fuels in decarbonization. So here we, again, have pretty high electrification, building electrification, about 60%, but we retain the clean fuels for electric generation. We also have clean fuels accessible for hard to abate activities. This is typically industrial with high heat demands and heavy duty transportation. We also assumed for purposes of this corner case scenario that there is no sequestration permitted. Again, these are corner cases to test the interactive effects. And we also assume for purposes of this scenario that we can blend up to 20% hydrogen into the pipeline with minimal retrofit costs. The next scenario is a high carbon sequestration. So here we wanted to understand the implications of large amounts of carbon sequestration and retaining fossil fuel in the pipeline. Again, pretty high levels of building electrification. We get to about 60% building electrification by 2045. And again, providing solutions for hard to abate activities and resiliency and reliability by allowing the fuels network. And last but not least is the no clean fuels network. And here we assumed that the entire gas system is decommissioned by 2045. So we have 100% building electrification. There is a small amount of clean fuels that's typically done and delivered through trucking for some activities like heavy duty transportation. But again, this assumes that there is no clean fuels network in place to support the energy transition. Next slide, please. So this slide here is outlines our criteria that we use to evaluate the various scenarios that we analyzed. So there are some key public interest criteria that we identified: system reliability and resiliency. To what extent does the scenario provide for a robust, resilient, and reliable system? And clearly we can see that a no fuels network is challenged here. There's no optionality of fuel source, it's single source. And so there are questions here in terms of the ability to truly provide reliability and resiliency, in particular in a future where electricity demand is projected to more than double. The next criteria is: to what extent do the scenarios provide a solution for hard to abate activities? Here, high clean fuels and high carbon sequestration score very well as they retain the fuels network to serve those customers. The no fuels network, again, the question is not having clean fuels available to the scale that's needed to keep these activities in state and decarbonized. It scored poorly there. And the resilient electrification is yellow. Again, we did retain the fuels backbone, but we don't have the same kind of broad fuels network that high clean fuels and high carbon sequestration provide. And that's why it has the yellow designation. And then customer conversion challenges. Here we essentially look to what is the anticipated lift and imposition on customers to reach the decarbonized end state. So with the no fuels network, we're assuming that all customers have to switch. The gas system fully decommissions. So that is going to require not only residential customers, but other industrial applications to find costly alternatives. And the resilient electrification is yellow as well, just because we assume almost 100% building electrification. So that's a pretty significant lift on our customer end. And technical maturity. So, to what extent are these solutions scalable? Here, the no fuels network, it is in orange, could very well be a close red. And again, we have to assume that there is a multi-day storage capability in this scenario that really just does not exist today. And that's why it doesn't score too well on the technical maturity. The yellow for the high clean fuels is simply to indicate that we have not yet tested that high of a blending rate in the pipeline, but we are encouraged by the learnings from Europe on this point. So that denotes the yellow. So essentially what the analysis shows is that the three options for California's energy system that employ a clean fuels network perform substantially better than a no clean fuels network. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So in summary, clean fuels are essential for decarbonizing those hard to abate activities such as industry and heavy duty transportation, all incredibly vital segments of the California economy. Clean fuels network supports electrification and reduces systemic risk of power outages. Dual fuel optionality is critical for resiliency and reliability. And a clean fuels network also takes advantage of repurposed infrastructure. So when we take advantage of repurposed infrastructure along with carbon management, we can deliver a more cost-effective solution, saving Californians as much as $75 billion while achieving the state's GHG goals.
And that's, you can see the website. When I'm dealing with people who I can buy something for, I tell my colleagues, if you can read the whole report from front to back in one sitting, I will buy you the beverage of your choice. It's kind of dense, but there is an executive summary. There's a lot of data in it. And as Commissioner Berman mentioned, I think it'll be circulated. So thank you, Despina. Just a couple of more slides here. One of them is, and a number of the states are going through dockets along the lines of California relating to how to update the gas system planning process. And we actually support what the general objective of this docket, which is to develop a more transparent and also integrated approach to planning out the gas system. And one key reason why we support it is because we actually know that the gas system is an indispensable enabler of decarbonization, as opposed to the way that, frankly, some stakeholders try to frame it as kind of the converse of that. We also know that, unlike the electric system, where when a state or a commission goes through an IRP process, a set of investments, oftentimes a set of investments that facilitate or lead to decarbonization of the electric grid, will result, whereas on the gas grid, there is not an analogous process. And generally, as we discussed, the emissions are our customers' emissions, not our emissions. So having a system where we can plan different actions and strategies for us assisting our customers in reducing their emissions, ultimately, I would say is beneficial both societally to our customers as well as to the utility. So we are putting forth a proposal for how this planning should be done. I know the Gas Committee has heard presentations at some of the more recent NARUC seminars relating to gas utility planning, which is an important aspect. What I would say is, much like is done on the electric side, we envision something like a 5-year planning cycle where we would be coming back to the commission every 5 years, but we would be looking at 30 or more years as we put forth specific actions and develop the different approaches and options that we would be taking as a utility from an operational infrastructure as well as a financial planning standpoint. So I'm not going to get too much into the details other than the one that I think is most near and dear to us. And that's one of the reasons we did that analysis, is that we would present our vision of what the system needs, allow the stakeholders and the commission to react to that. And so one thing that we're very cognizant of is that the modeling that Despina just described, and much of the modeling that many of you have seen in your states, is kind of what we would call end state backcast models that goes out to 2050 or 2045 and looks at what are the different approaches to economy-wide decarbonization. But of course, we cannot plan our system based on the outcomes of those models. We have to plan our system from today going forward. So we've developed a separate modeling platform and approach that takes those economy-wide scenarios and feeds them into our integrated modeling framework, which includes both our system hydraulic model, our GIS-driven hydraulic model, also includes a electric production cost model so that it's projecting forward prices on the electric sector, and as well as gas market demand from the electric sector, and then a gas market pricing fundamentals model. So we can use this model to assess demand at a more granular level, starting from the present, look at what's expected of us to support electric generation, different decarbonization demand scenarios, can consider different changes to gas composition, including hydrogen, and then of course, the transmission segments necessary for clean fuel delivery. And consistently, what all these models are showing us is that, notwithstanding that annual traditional natural gas use demand decreases over the course of the year. On a peak day, peak hour, and peak 3-hour period, we see demand increasing because the electric generators are increasingly relying on us. And so in order to provide that reliability and peakiness, peaky resiliency function to the energy system as a whole, the modeling consistently shows that gas burn during those peak periods increases in deep decarbonization scenarios. So this is a projection that we got from one of our consultants using that integrated model that basically shows, you can see the days of the year at the bottom. And what it shows is the more rapid and deeper the decarbonization scenario, while the lower the annual throughput is, the higher the peak daily and 3-day throughput is. And this has been a consistent outcome, including through the modeling that the California Public Utilities Commission has done. And it stands for a very important and fundamental proposition, which is, as certain of the stakeholders focus on, let's say, decommissioning certain of the natural gas infrastructure, it's critical in order to achieve decarbonization within the public interest to maintain not just a creditworthy gas utility, but one that is more capable during these peak hourly and peak daily periods to provide the resiliency and reliability that the system depends on. And another finding, and I would suggest policy need that flows from that, is so you're seeing a large decrease in annual throughput, but you're seeing a more important need for and value of the ability to meet those peak reliability and resiliency periods. I'm not going to get into great depth on what this slide shows. The point is that as you would evolve a system along those lines, it requires rethinking of the way costs are allocated and rates are designed. And a simple way to look at that is if you have a high degree of electrification, so you've got a lot of residential customers that are getting off the gas system and moving to the electric system, the reliability and resiliency of that electric system depends on the capabilities of the gas system. But yet they're no longer paying for that reliability and resiliency. The gas system was basically built by the residential and small business customers paying for it, which means that you're going to have to come up with new structures for cost allocation to make sure, whether it's through the electric system, whether it's through pricing of those daily and intraday variations that the gas system provides in a different way that we've been doing it, that is part of thinking about the implications of economy-wide decarbonization when you have this convergent integrated gas and electric system and this continuing need for the gas system. So I think this is the last slide. And this slide is just designed to show some of the interaction between the gas grid and electrification. In many circles, there are some who would suggest that we're going to be moving to a 90+% electrified system when it comes to the small business and residential customers who the gas utilities are designed and whose interests they serve. That's why we have a monopoly. What we did was we did an analysis, a qualitative analysis of those areas that are likely to kind of stay dependent on the gas system more so than electrify, and therefore prospectively the need for either clean fuels or carbon management in order to decarbonize while providing those services. So you can see some of the factors on the left. We know the industrial customers will have a bias towards maintaining gas infrastructure in California, where, for example, in the San Diego gas and electric service territory, 60% of customers live in high fire threat districts. That would be a bias towards maintaining the resiliency services of the gas grid. And you can kind of see through their topographical complexity, diversity of end uses. On the flip side, if there are high pipeline O&M costs, then you would lean towards taking out the service and decommissioning and moving towards full electrification, et cetera. My big takeaway from this is that even in an aggressive electrification scenario, and Commissioner Berman, this is similar to what the New York City study showed, you might get to somewhere in the area of 50% building electrification, perhaps slightly more. I think those that are proposing that we're going to get to a much higher number than that, in many instances, the the practical realities will not bear out that way. But the point is that it's a symbiotic and synergistic relationship that is served by both the gas system and the electric grid as we decarbonize. So that is our last slide. We very much encourage folks to come and meet at the UCal Irvine Advanced Power and Energy lab and program. It's incredible what they've got going on there with respect to hydrogen, with respect to biogas and fuels, the whole bit. And you can see it all firsthand in their lab. So that's my plug for the site visit, and that is the last slide.
Well, that was really very, very helpful. And thank you for plugging the tour. I know Kira is going to be sending around the information. And I do think it's critical because a lot of this information, being on the ground and seeing it and having a further conversation can be very, very helpful. You know, some of my key takeaways from listening, you talked, about a couple of things that I think are really important. You talked about the fact that you were looking at the reporting and delving in based on what the California legislation and regulations are, and that it wasn't that you were trying to push back on the policy, and in fact, we're leaning into it. And I think that's important. However, I will put that as a big asterisk because that's something for us as regulatory policymakers and engaged in this process is that there are times where our policies may make sense or may only make sense in a larger context with how we're going to achieve things. And so for us, it's important to really collaborate and engage in a way that is allowing those who are on the ground, those who are overseeing it, and those stakeholders who are really engaged to make sure that we are allowing them to give us the critical information on what it will take, because you talked about the modeling being also different than the actual current situation and the planning that it will take. And so there will be a lot of times some things that will not necessarily align. And it's not that you got your report wrong or the planning wrong, but it may be actually a core issue with the actual initial policy and how it needs to be evolving to be implemented in a proper way that is ensuring resiliency, reliability, customer sensitivities, as well as others. The other thing you talked about, which I think is important, is the customer vulnerabilities that are there and that make up a significant portion of some of the sensitivities that go into that report, because the vulnerabilities are something that really you're very sensitive to for your customers and sort of the grid as a whole. And then also that it is not an apples to apples comparison on the electric side to the gas side. And that doesn't mean that the gas side needs to completely change to the electric side, but it does mean that when we are talking about what it takes from a transparency perspective, from an operational perspective, from a technical perspective, you can't just say, well, they do it this way in the electric side, so therefore we're going to do it this way on the gas side, because sometimes it just may not make sense or needs to be defined appropriately. And then the other thing is the consistency that you're focused on, the consistency in going back to what the policies are and the clear planning processes. And while you're looking at it from a 30-year perspective, knowing that you may have to come back every 5 years and do some refinements, but being sensitive to that you have to look at the whole. So it can't be that every 5 years, everything just gets completely changed, because that will impact your 30-year forecast for a lot of this. And so being mindful of that. For me, one of the issues is kind of asking where you see now this report, the different staging, where is the sensitivity from the regulatory community as well as the legislative community in terms of giving this glide path from the report and what may happen next?
So first of all, thank you, Commissioner Berman. I think your insights and your takeaways are spot on. In fact, they're far superior to mine. But I think those really are the critical takeaways. I think like every situation, both in terms of the jurisdiction, the dynamics within the jurisdiction, the evolution of the policy, the politics, for us, the important need that we needed to address in terms of where things are is to convince people that there is this naturally symbiotic, synergistic role as between the gas and the electric system. There's a tendency, I want to say this gently, there's a tendency among stakeholders to view them as at odds with each other from a decarbonization standpoint. So what we really knew we needed to do right from the get-go was create kind of the database and the setting where we can start looking at these problems sort of in a cooperative, collaborative, integrated, convergent way, rather than viewing, for example, traditional natural gas as an obstacle to decarbonizing. That's why I always start, by the way, by saying you would have no renewables on the electric grid if it wasn't for what the gas grid provides. So we're in a process here, Commissioner Berman, where we're trying to move the ball forward in terms of what I would call efficiency, collaborative planning, rather than one which I think we're all, for better or for worse, familiar with, is one where people have this tendency to try to demonize the perspectives or the role of one utility or industry versus another. So I think that is the starting point in terms of why we did it. It's too early to say. We just released the report. I think our engagement with our regulators and stakeholders is suggesting that by us moving forward in a way that, to your point earlier, seeks to work concurrently with and support the state's policies, including electrification, has been viewed very favorably here. So hopefully we're kind of creating a beneficial collaborative platform for moving forward. I hope that was responsive. I mean, I don't know, Despina, if you have anything you want to add to that.
I think you covered it.
Well,
Thank
thank you both. I do know that I believe that there may be some questions from the attendees. Folks should feel comfortable either raising their hand, putting a question into the chat, or unmuting. I want to turn it over to anyone who may have a question. I can ask some, but I believe we do have some people who had indicated they were going to be asking some questions.
Waiting.
Andreas, I see
Yeah.
looks like you have a question. Shocking.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Despina. Thank you, Jonathan. I have a question. It's a question that's been coming up a lot lately, and I was asked actually the question in NARUC in Louisville. I had no answer to it, but in your presentation, I noticed that there were two things that were missing. The first one is, where is energy efficiency in all this? And the second one is, we're talking about the affordable, resilient, and feasible energy transition. But when we talk about this, I think it's your slide 8. Yes, correct. Your 8th slide says a clean fuels network supports electrification. Do you guys have any studies that show the cost to residential customers, which is the more not fragile, but the ones that are going to get impacted the most by any efforts to electrify the system? Are there any cost studies that regulators can look at? That's it. That's my question.
Despina, you want to take this?
I'll take the first part, the energy efficiency, and I'll let you take the second part, Jonathan. So yes, energy efficiency is a very important tool, and that is actually factored into our demand side model, the energy pathways. So we do assume pretty aggressive amounts of electrification consistent with SB 350's doubling of existing energy efficiency. Now, I think it's also important to note, right, that there's the modeling, and then there's also the modeling fiction, and then the reality. So when you start layering on aggressive assumption over aggressive assumption over aggressive assumption, it's just something to always be mindful of in terms of the need to consistently recalibrate and continue to do the modeling work, but recognizing the points where there may need to be certain kind of policy pivots to ensure that we are actually getting to where we need to be by 2045.
Thank you, Despina. Before Jonathan takes over to the next part, but it seems I don't have numbers, but just in the back of my mind, it would seem more economic, if you will, to push for more energy efficiency, as you mentioned, than trying to electrify any residence, because there are costs that we don't talk about within the property and right outside the power lines. So that's my concern about not putting as much emphasis on energy efficiency as we were 10 years ago, for instance. So I hear you what you said. I understand what you said.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with you, but it's something that seems to be getting pushed aside in our, as we gallop towards full electrification. Thanks. Thank you, Despina, again. And Jonathan, your turn, my friend.
Yeah, so as to the second part of the question, Andreas, we were very careful in the way that we put forth the study to not have ourselves viewed as somehow being adverse to electrification. So as Despina mentioned, and just to put a finer point on it, all four of those corner cases end up with somewhere between 55 to 90% of full residential electrification by 2050. All of them do. That being said, there is an extensive discussion in the paper in chapter 7, which talks about some of the cost considerations around electrification. And it notes a study that San Francisco did relating to the cost of conversion of buildings in San Francisco to electrification. I'm not going to get the numbers right, but I believe it was on average between $18,000 and $35,000 per building, per residence. Now, there was some distinction between multifamily and single family, and they calculated a rather high number in the billions. I think it was in excess of, it was in the $3 to $5 billion range as to what would be necessary to achieve a high level of electrification in San Francisco. We could have done more studying of that. We decided to stick more with the qualitative approach rather than a quantitative approach, because we did not want to be positioned as somehow pushing back on the conventional wisdom around electrification. The only other thing I would add, Andreas, which is also discussed in chapter 7 and is part of our cost allocation discussion, is, so there's a discussion about, so do we use public money? Do we use ratepayer money to advance building electrification? And then the outcome of that is a set of inequities that also require some sort of cost allocation in order to resolve. And others have said, oh, well, we can subsidize those folks that suffer the inequitable consequences of electrifying as well. Like that, there's a report that came out from UCal Berkeley and the lab there, the Haas Center, about that. So, I mean, writ large, I would tend to agree with you that the study shows that investing, maximizing energy efficiency, recognizing the limitations, and reusing and repurposing gas infrastructure to the extent that you can ends up being the most cost-effective approach to decarbonizing.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Despina.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any question? I don't see any hands. If you want to unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
Commissioner Berman, I just have a quick question, if I could ask Jonathan and Despina. Can you talk about any kind of technical issues associated with storing clean fuels in facilities like Aliso Canyon? I think a couple of weeks ago, the CPUC voted to increase the amount of gas that will be stored in Aliso Canyon for the upcoming, I think, winter season, as we're transitioning to maybe higher amounts of hydrogen and renewable natural gas. are there kind of any issues associated or different ways that we need to look at storing those clean fuels?
So I'll start. I don't know if Despina has something to add. I should mention that we had a technical partner internally on the paper who's not on the call, Drury Friedman, and he's sort of our scientist PhD guy. But Kira, the point you just made and about, yes, they lifted the limit on storage at Aliso Canyon, which is one of the largest storage facilities in the country and is sitting smack in the middle of the load pocket of LA. It's actually a validation of the point that we're making, that the more you put renewables on the system, the more you need that responsiveness that comes from storage, and California is experiencing that firsthand. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between this notion of decommissioning these facilities at the same time that the more you go to a renewable and higher demand system on the electric side, the more you need those facilities. So we are doing some technical analysis of the best storage options for hydrogen. I unfortunately don't have the expertise to really speak to that. It could be that salt. We know that salt domes are probably going to be, just like they are for gas storage, probably going to be the most effective place to store hydrogen. But I don't want to prejudge that. Despina, is there anything that you can add to this? We really need to ask Yuri that question, and I apologize, Kira.
Yeah, I agree. I think Yuri is probably the best to do a deeper dive on this, and will certainly be kind of a good opportunity when we meet in person too, and UC Irvine to be, get into these more technical issues. We'll have depth of expertise present there.
Thanks. I think we have just a couple of minutes left, so if we want to go next to Commissioner Fedorchak.
Very good, thank you. I'll be quick. And I really loved this approach, and thank you both for such a great presentation. When you talk about using the gas infrastructure to support electrification, to support the decarbonization, are you largely looking at converting that system for electric generation, or are you assuming that a good chunk of it is being used to the home with clean fuels? Or can you kind of give a breakdown of what kind of percent of each of those you're looking at in your modeling?
Despina, you want to take that one?
Sure, it would depend on the scenario implicated. But for example, when you look at the resilient electrification, so we kept the fuel back system, so that is primarily the transmission. There still is some of the distribution system that is remaining, but there's more that's decommissioned because you're getting to over 90% of building electrification at that point. But we retain that kind of resilient label because there's the fuel backbone to support the electric generation. And we do provide, I think, a few dedicated kind of hydrogen pipelines to certain hard to abate activities, certain industry and transportation needs, and then the fuel cells that were added as well to provide additional resiliency in areas where electrification alone would be a bit challenged. So you had that scenario, and then you had kind of our high clean fuels, right, which assumes a much larger portion of the distribution and the transmission system is retained, and you've got a more robust and efficient fuels network. And then the other extreme is the no fuels scenario, where we assumed complete decommissioning of the gas system in 2045. So we really kind of tested varying levels and configurations of retaining the fuels network. Hopefully that helps. Jonathan.
And we are testing hydrogen blending. And in fact, if you make it to the site visit at UCal Irvine, they've got a whole room that's full of stock OEM manufacturers, water heaters and stoves, and they're putting different levels of hydrogen, concentrations of hydrogen, to see how that equipment reacts to it. We, based on the European analysis, we're thinking that up to a 20% blend will be achievable. We're also experimenting with ways where you can take some of that hydrogen out of the pipeline so that you can concentrate it into 100% pipeline stream for those users that would need 100% hydrogen. So different approaches are being explored. As Despina mentioned, we used a 20% assumption for the high clean fuels corner case.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So I think we've come to the witching hour. I'm going to turn it back over to Chair Kimbrell to close this out. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Berman. Big thanks to Jonathan and Despina for their presentation. Also, a big thank you to Commissioner Berman for leading the discussion. I'd also like to thank the U.S. Department of Energy for supporting the Natural Gas Partnership. Our next Gas Committee call is Monday, December 13th at noon Central Time. At that time, we will have an update on the Winter Policy Summit gas panel agendas to share with everyone. So that's all that I have. Kara, was there anything you want to add, or are we all set?
Yep, that's all. Thank you very much, Despina and Jonathan.
Thank you. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays
Happy
to you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.